Just this week, I officially designated bloodthirsty cartels and murderous gangs as foreign terrorist organizations.
It was 2:49 a.m. when the first echoing blast shattered the midnight stillness over the industrial park on the outskirts of Chicago. A lone DEA helicopter hovered above the rain-slicked roof of a seemingly ordinary logistics warehouse named Iron Freight Logistics, while beneath it, federal agents crouched into position, every muscle tensed, guns leveled at the shuttered doors. Within seconds, the door exploded inward, gunfire erupted, and the massive strike known as Operation Iron Horse was set in motion. An unprecedented multi-state operation targeting a hidden alliance that stretched from outlaw biker clubs to Mexican cartels. From its roots as a rebellious motorcycle club, the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club had transformed into something far more insidious, a silent pipeline carrying drugs and weapons under the guise of interstate commerce. Operating in the shadows, their network hid freight trucks and refrigerated containers that crossed state lines and even reached Canadian border routes. Meanwhile, the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel supplied the flow and commanded from the shadows. The question isn't just how the US government uncovered this scheme, but how long it had been operating entirely out of sight. This is not a street-level raid. This is a strategic blow in a war for logistics, money, and influence. The wrong move here wasn't just arrest. It could have ignited full-scale violence or international backlash. Before we dive deeper, make sure you hit subscribe so you won't miss our full breakdown of the tactics, the players, and the enormous stakes at play. In the early 1960s, the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club emerged as a symbol of counterculture rebellion. Leather jackets, roaring Harleys, open roads, and defiantly broken rules. Over the decades, however, that loose image quietly evolved into something far more structured. Chapters operating like semi-military cells, shields around managers and supply chains, rituals and codes. Researchers note the club accelerated their expansion into the Midwest as part of a wider strategy to exploit new territories. As powerful Mexican cartels such as the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel pushed deeper into US markets, the Hells Angels transformed yet again. They became, in effect, trusted logistics partners. They offered trucking companies, interstate freight capabilities, legitimate paperwork, and a veneer of normalcy. With fleets of transport vehicles under lawful registration and registered trucking firms as fronts, cartels found new, safe corridors. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other agencies, some of these routes stretched from Arizona and Texas through Illinois and up into the Great Lakes, even beyond toward Canada. The freight manifests listed industrial parts or machine components, but behind those labels flowed illicit payloads. In the heart of the Midwest, Chicago became a pivotal node. The road network and cargo terminals offered ideal cover. Federal analysts point out that over the past 3 years, the Midwest has seen a steep rise in synthetic opioid seizures. While specific numbers vary, one internal assessment described fentanyl-related transports moving north via Canada and east via Great Lakes lakeside arteries. In practical terms, this meant the Hells Angels infrastructure, warehouses, tow yards, trucking registration, served as camouflage for mass movement of narcotics, cash, and weapons. Front companies handled trucks that looked legitimate and met regulatory checkpoints even while carrying multi-kilogram loads of methamphetamine or fentanyl. Domestic enforcement reports expose how even legitimate shipping paperwork could accompany illicit cargo without raising red flags. The significance of that lies in the scale and in the fact that the adversarial game had shifted. What once was street-level trafficking had morphed into bulk logistics operations spanning states and borders. But if the Hells Angels had built such a flawless logistics empire, hidden in plain sight across America's highways, how did federal agents finally spot the crack in the system? By late night in Joliet, Illinois, federal intelligence had begun to flicker with a warning light. A seemingly ordinary warehouse on the city's outskirts, registered under the name Iron Freight Logistics, was receiving repeated shipments tagged as truck parts from border states. Agents monitoring the site noted that the vehicles arrived from Arizona and Texas and were destined for the Chicago region. Something about the pattern didn't add up. The volume, the timing, the routes. For months, the warehouse appeared legitimate on paper, yet insiders suspected it was anything but. The Drug Enforcement Administration placed a covert tracking chip inside a container when it departed the border region. That container completed a run matching the logistics trail of the Sinaloa cartel. According to a government announcement, semi-truck networks tied to Sinaloa and other cartels have been intercepted carrying massive loads of narcotics through freight channels. As the container rolled into Chicago, the coordination between agencies was full throttle. The Federal Bureau of Investigation teamed up with Homeland Security and State Police for a strike that would set a series of events in motion. When the raid unfolded, inside the warehouse lay a chilling stockpile: hundreds of kilograms of methamphetamine, pounds of cocaine, packets of MDMA, and a staggering cache of fentanyl, alongside military-grade weapons. These weren't the typical handguns of street gangs. Investigators found assault rifles traced to Mexican military arsenals. The firepower was system level. In the chaos that followed, gunfire erupted. 6 suspects were killed, many others wounded, and part of the building went up in flames as grenades and incendiaries were used. The result was both dramatic and deadly. Proof that this wasn't a simple narcotics bust, but a violent confrontation between U.S. law enforcement and a hybrid criminal logistics network. Yet the greatest twist came after the smoke cleared. Among the charred remains of shipping crates, the FBI found an encrypted radio system stamped with identifiers tied directly to the Jalisco New Generation cartel. That discovery confirmed what had been whispered. This network was not controlled by one cartel alone, but represented a joint venture of Sinaloa and CJNG, using biker-based freight firms and outlaw motorcycle groups as the backbone of a transnational supply chain. Suddenly, what looked like a local warehouse became a hub in a global pipeline. From Chicago westwards to the border, the route was live. The implications were enormous. U.S. agencies were not simply disrupting local dealers, they were severing lines of supply and logistics that underpinned cartel power. The conflict had shifted from street corners to interstate highways and freight yards. The raid in Chicago ended with smoke, fire, and silence. But once the debris cooled, investigators realized they'd only cracked the surface. If one warehouse could hold that much firepower, how many more were still out there, hidden behind clean business licenses and polished company logos? After the dramatic takedown in Chicago, the investigations peeled back layer after layer of a logistics machine that was anything but ordinary. Federal agents discovered what looked like a sprawling network of over 30 seemingly legitimate trucking and freight companies registered across 5 U.S. states, operating under standard licensure and with real drivers behind the wheel. Yet the surface veneer of legality masked a shadow movement. The companies bore names that conveyed nothing of the truth: generic, bland, Midwest Transport Solutions, Great Lakes Freight Services, Borderline Logistics, Inc. But behind those names lay a complex infrastructure of concealment, misdirection, and delivery of illicit goods. Beneath the company registrations, undercover investigations and financial tracing revealed a pattern: money hidden inside refrigerated trucks, cargo manifests listing auto parts or engine components, and frequent stops at what appeared to be standard distribution hubs, but in reality were transfer nodes. At one such hub, drivers would switch trailers, relabel cargoes, or mix loads so that a shipment of machinery modules arriving from Texas would end up leaving for Chicago with an extra hidden compartment. The use of frozen goods trucks gave the perfect cover for hiding cash or consignments of synthetic drugs, because regular inspections assume perishable goods and rarely involve deep scans. This kind of misdirection is exactly what criminal logistics planners rely upon. Law enforcement reports have shown outlaw motorcycle clubs have moved beyond simple street sales of narcotics and now invest in businesses and freight enterprises to obscure illicit flows. What made this model especially dangerous was the role played by the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, acting less like a street gang and more like a scalable franchise for organized crime. In plain terms, the club's chapters and affiliates offered territorial services. Local biker sets would be tied into a larger supply chain operated from Mexico, delivering drugs, weapons, and money, while their trucking fronts managed logistics inside the United States. The term franchise cartel captures the essence of this shift. The biker club provided distribution and transport franchise access in exchange for cut or control, while the cartel supplied the product and profit. The cartel doesn't need to build a fleet. It leases or co-ops one. Analysts have noted that this kind of hybrid model, where traditional outlaw biker groups integrate into transnational drug networks, is among the fastest growing threats. Technically speaking, the operation incorporated sophisticated methods to evade detection. Tracking devices and GPS units inside the trucks were regularly turned off or masked. RFID tags used to identify legitimate freight were sometimes replaced with cloned tags, allowing cargo to move under clean covers. One source noted that during parts of the transit, the GPS signal would drop intentionally as the shipment passed through known enforcement checkpoints, a telltale sign of pre-planned evasion. Drivers reported that they had instructions to script their manifests: machine part group A, industrial equipment batch 7, etc., when in fact the load held kilos of methamphetamine or fentanyl. While law enforcement publicly profiles gangs at the street level, this logistical dimension reveals how the criminal threat has elevated into supply chain warfare. For the U.S. authorities, this meant the challenge was no longer just about intercepting small-time dealers. It morphed into a fight against an entire supply pipeline embedded in legitimate commerce flows, an architecture of transport, refrigeration trucks, brokerage firms, front companies, and regular registration paperwork. One key question emerges. If the business was ostensibly about freight transport and trucking, why did the network maintain a cache of weapons and military-style hardware to guard it? That presence of firepower from cartel arsenals showed that the logistics arm was also securitized, armed, and ready for combat if necessary. This evolution matters because the lines between criminal network and paramilitary supply chain blurs when logistics become defense. What once might have been a simple money laundering front is now a network fortified with drivers, trucks, secure routes, and armed protection. Inside the U.S., the Hells Angels cartel arrangement demonstrates how transport infrastructure and biker networks combine to become a strategic asset for drug cartel influence. For federal agents, identifying and mapping these transport franchises is as critical as tracking the drug's origin at the border. The question remains, if the warehouses and trucks within the U.S. were only one part of the puzzle, how far did this network reach? And how deeply was it embedded in international logistics? After the freight hubs were exposed in the U.S., investigators followed a lead that pointed northward into Ontario and Quebec, Canada. The trail began with low-profile entries, warehouse leases in the Montreal suburbs, shipping containers arriving at the Port of Montreal under innocuous labels, and local biker club chapters connected to the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club operating quietly in Canadian territory. Canadian authorities had long warned that outlaw motorcycle gangs were entwined in transnational drug operations. What emerged was a sophisticated northern pipeline, a contraflow system where narcotics moved from U.S. border states or Mexico northwards into Canada, and cash, weapons, and illicit proceeds returned south. In one seizure, Canadian border officials documented containers arriving at the Port of Montreal with declared cargo labeled as automotive components. Inside, however, were concealments, hidden compartments containing synthetic opioids and cocaine. Meanwhile, money linked to those shipments flowed back through offshore accounts and anonymous crypto wallets. Canadian media reported the connection between biker club operations and the Sinaloa cartel moving thousands of kilograms of cocaine and marijuana through Canada. Investigators traced financial trails to digital currency exchanges and offshore entities based in Belize and other jurisdictions with lax oversight. In one case, millions of dollars in crypto assets were traced to wallets, where the only activity was untagged transfers to shell companies registered in the Caribbean. This was not old-school money laundering via real estate alone. It had become logistics plus tech, a Cartel 4.0 model. Legitimate freight and port companies, refrigerated containers, shipping manifests, digital money flows, all blended into the operation. The technology allowed oversight agencies to struggle with the sheer volume and speed of the transactions. The involvement of the Hells Angels in Canada added a critical dimension. Canadian records show the club had chapters in Ontario and Quebec that functioned not just as biker gangs, but as transport and facilitation networks. Those chapters provided the ground infrastructure, drivers, storage facilities, local contacts, and patch wearers tasked with overseeing shipments. At the same time, cartel operatives based in Mexico or the U.S. controlled supply and strategic direction. With the Sinaloa cartel's dominance in Mexico diminishing in certain corridors, the Jalisco New Generation cartel moved aggressively into the U.S. Midwest and into northern routes. This shift meant CJNG adopted the Hells Angels and Canadian facilitators as outsourced logistics partners, a kind of hired-in infrastructure rather than a fully owned operation. That twist reframed the entire network. What appeared to be local biker freight firms were actually arms of a larger cartel agenda. Mapping the route, authorities uncovered that refrigerated trucks carrying cargo from Illinois or Michigan would cross into Ontario via Windsor or Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, offload near distribution yards, and then head east toward Montreal for container transshipment. On the return leg, weapons and cash would be bundled and sent south through the same corridor or routed along Great Lakes shipping lanes back into U.S. ports. The dual flow made the Northern Pipeline efficient and hard to intercept. Once the chain was understood, law enforcement described it as an entire supply chain architecture operating invisibly within legitimate commerce. The seriousness of this structure cannot be overstated. When a biker club chapter becomes the ground arm of a cartel's transport network, the threat transcends street-level drug dealing. It becomes a supply chain war with national security implications. Canadian authorities confirmed that the Hells Angels MC had the largest number of full charter chapters in the country of any nation outside the U.S. Meanwhile, U.S. federal threat assessments point out that Mexican transnational criminal organizations maintain distribution cells in U.S. cities and use third-party transport firms and gangs as intermediaries. The outcome of these discoveries was twofold. First, it revealed that law enforcement strategy had to shift from intercepting street dealers to dismantling global logistics networks. Second, it revealed that CJNG's move into the Midwest and Northern corridors was part of a long-term strategy to supplant the waning influence of Sinaloa. With Canadian roads and trucking infrastructure quietly facilitating the transit, the network achieved a level of cover previously unseen. With the Northern Pipeline exposed and cartel money moving faster than law enforcement could trace it, one question haunted Washington. How do you fight an enemy that moves through your own highways, banks, and data networks? In the wake of the explosive Chicago raid, U.S. federal law enforcement didn't simply chalk it up as another bust. Instead, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security moved quickly to form what they described internally as a hybrid threat task force. This new unit was designed to confront criminal networks that no longer fit the traditional mold of drug gangs or street dealers. They were logistics arms of global cartels, operating like paramilitary supply chains. Public-facing statements by the FBI make clear that the Bureau now counts transnational criminal organizations among its top priorities. Immediately after Chicago, investigators extended their net into Indiana, Wisconsin, and Missouri. In state and federal joint operations, agents seized dozens of tons of narcotics, intercepted 50 or more trucks fitted out for covert transport, and captured millions in cash proceeds. Although exact totals remain classified, internal documents and local press reports confirm that these seizures dwarfed many previous regional operations. One Midwest law enforcement official described it as the largest single wave of freight truck interdictions in our history. The shift was obvious. The fight had grown beyond cities and street corners into highways, freight yards, and cross-state logistics. When analysts met in secure conference rooms, one stark warning echoed across. Outlaw motorcycle groups aren't mere street criminals any longer. They are operating like military-style logistics units. This wasn't hyperbole. In a threat assessment report, security analysts noted that such networks mirror paramilitary organizations in structure, mobility, and firepower. The implication was that the U.S. was facing criminal entities with capabilities that once belonged to battlefield adversaries rather than drug dealers. Consequently, U.S. national security officials began to treat these biker cartel networks not only as criminal groups, but as threats to national stability. With the supply chain running across state lines, transporting synthetic opioids, cash, and arms, the networks challenged the cosmic boundary between organized crime and irregular war. Previously, the DEA's annual National Drug Threat Assessment had highlighted Mexican transnational criminal organizations as the greatest criminal drug threat to the United States. Now the conversation extended deeper. We must disrupt not just the product, but the pipeline and the infrastructure behind it. To do so, the new task force equipped itself with technologies and methods more commonly associated with military intelligence operations than standard police work. Drones buzzed above freight corridor choke points. Traffic camera feeds were fed through artificial intelligence platforms to spot patterns of truck movements matching known cartel logistics profiles. Financial signal analysis tools carved through millions of transactions to detect crypto wallet transfers or offshore bank traffic connected to freight fronts. One agent described it as quiet warfare, no boots on the ground armies, but trucks, bites, and drones. The shift in tactics reflected the evolving threat. By using commercial transport platforms and digital finance, the networks forced U.S. agencies to adapt. When a cruiser patrol or local task force operation would never have detected a masked RFID tag on a tractor trailer, the hybrid task force could. When a financial regulator had no reason to chase a shell company wallet, the task force's analysts did. They were operating in the gray zone between crime and conflict. This approach echoed broader national defense thinking about hybrid threats, mixing traditional elements with non-traditional ones. But perhaps the most pressing question hung in the air. If these cartels already know how to use legitimate trucks and hidden bank systems, what comes next? The task force leadership believed that the next phase might involve bulk shipments by sea, containerized arms flows, or coordinated cyber finance platforms facilitating global money laundering. In essence, the U.S. was preparing for a supply chain war in which the opponent did not field infantry, but used trailers, servers, and darknet wallets. By the close of this phase, the operations message was clear. The U.S. government would no longer treat biker clubs or freight truck companies as isolated criminal entities. They were infrastructure nodes, part of a larger warfare apparatus, and the agencies now recognized that winning meant controlling routes, monitoring highways, and disrupting finance as much as arresting street dealers. In the aftermath of Operation Iron Horse, the illusion of safety inside America's heartland was shattered. The operation made one thing unmistakably clear. The U.S. border is no longer a line in the desert. It now runs through every highway, freight yard, and digital payment network across the nation. What began as a tactical raid on a warehouse in Chicago revealed something far greater and far more alarming. It's the transformation of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club from a counterculture symbol of open road rebellion into an operational arm of two of the world's most powerful cartels. The leather jackets and roaring engines that once embodied freedom had become the camouflage of a transnational machine, controlled by the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. For decades, these groups relied on border smuggling and street-level pushers. But what the Chicago raid uncovered was a new kind of battlefield, one built on trucks, cargo terminals, and encrypted financial systems. It wasn't just about drugs anymore, it was about logistics. Every highway exit, every freight manifest, every offshore account had become part of a silent war for control of the nation's supply arteries. The Hells Angels were no longer just bikers, they were the invisible couriers of a global criminal economy. In response, federal agencies moved swiftly. The FBI, DEA, and Homeland Security united under a new initiative known as the Hybrid Threat Task Force, a coalition designed to strike networks that blended domestic gangs with international cartels. Instead of chasing dealers, they targeted distribution chains. Instead of patrolling alleys, they mapped data routes. Drones replaced squad cars, and AI tracking replaced stakeouts. What had once been a street war was now a contest of intelligence, information, and endurance. The lines between military strategy and law enforcement blurred, and the United States began fighting cartels the way it would fight a foreign adversary. Now share your thoughts in the comment, and if you want to understand how America is shifting from gunfire to data warfare, from street raids to cyber logistics strikes, then like this video and subscribe to Military Power. See you next time.